So right now, if you are looking at the screen, you should be seeing a forested landscape with the words "The Forest Awakens" on the screen. If you're not seeing that, okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for being here today. These are clearly unusual and challenging days, and we at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts are really grateful to have time with you. This is our second installation in the Nature Connects webinar series. With Nature Connects, we seek to create opportunities for you to hear from and ask questions of leading TNC scientists who are working to tackle climate change, conserve land and water, and find innovative solutions to providing food and water sustainably. I'm James Miller. I'm your host today for The Forest Awakens with Andy Fenton. Andy is the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts Landscape Conservation Director. Even and maybe particularly in times like these, nature provides a refuge for us. I hope and think that you'll find Andy's really unique perspective on what happens in the forest in spring might change even a little bit the way you think about what's around you the next time you're out in the woods or in a city park. A little bit about Andy. Andy's expertise is in forest and landscape ecology, spatial analyses, and protecting landscapes that benefit people and nature. He's been with the Nature Conservancy since 1997, applying current science to define lasting conservation outcomes. Just one example, Andy led a project with the Massachusetts Natural Heritage Program to develop Biomap 2, which is a conservation blueprint for Massachusetts identifying resilient habitats in the face of climate change. Andy earned a BS in plant sciences from Cornell and an MS in forest ecology from UMass Amherst. He's also worked as an ecologist for the Massachusetts and New York Natural Heritage Programs, the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Before I hand off the webinar to Andy, I just do a couple more housekeeping notes. Again, everyone is muted. There's a chat box at the bottom of the screen if you have technical problems. You can also find a Q&A box where you can enter questions for Andy. So throughout the presentation, whatever comes to your mind, please put it in the Q&A box. And I will be asking some of those questions of Andy after his presentation, which will last about 15 minutes. If you're having any trouble viewing the presentation, at the top of your screen, there is a view option. You should be able to pull down a menu that says fit to window, and that should correct your view. Again, any problems, talk to us through the chat box and we'll do our best to help. And thank you again so much for being with us. And here is Andy Fenton.
Great, thank you, James. And thank you to everyone for joining this afternoon. Normally I would genuinely say that I wish we were all together in the same room, but unfortunately this is the best medium for us to share this discussion. And with that, as I was putting slides together this Monday, previous Monday, I got an email from a colleague, and I want to start by reading just a brief sentence from that email. I've been doing my usual hikes with my dog in the woods, which seems to be a saving grace these days. It's the only place that feels safe and invigorating as spring comes to life. Wood frogs quacking, peepers still a bit quiet, a couple turtles basking. The woods are more crowded than usual, as many more people and families are appreciating the benefits of the outdoors these days. Yay, nature. I'm amazed and humbled by how many stories I've heard of people seeking the healing powers of nature in these really challenging times. And despite what we're all going through right now, I want to use this time to take a bit of a respite from our challenges and the daunting things in front of us, and take us to a place that gives me calm and peace, which is the forest, and hopefully is the same for many of you. There are 32 million acres of forest across New England, And right now, these forests are coming alive. I, I kind of see these forests as right now they're leaning back and they're having a big cup of morning coffee and they're about to go out and have a very productive day. And these forests are critical to our health and well-being. So I tend to think about these forests at this big scale across New England, across Massachusetts. But I want to zoom in. I want to zoom into the scale of a much smaller being, a tiny spring peeper, no bigger than the size of the end of my thumb. And in the spring, these peepers, these little frogs, these native frogs, they spend the winter in the forest and they come out of the forest and they hop to the nearest wetland where they breed, they lay eggs, their tadpoles grow, and the next generation comes. And these peepers, they are dependent on intact forests and adjacent to large wetlands, small wetlands, and these woodland pools called vernal ponds, vernal meaning springtime pools, where they gather by the hundreds. And starting this month, the males begin to call, trying to attract females. And what I'm going to do now is play a brief recording that I made 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, in the forests of Western Massachusetts on a hike with my family. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this. If not, rest assured that I'll be back in just about 10 seconds. But what you're about to hear is you're going to hear some high-pitched chirping noises that might sound to you like a bird or a cricket, but that's actually the sound of the male spring peeper making its call. You'll also hear in the background some croaking noises. Those are wood frogs that also spend the winter in the forest and come out and breed in these wetlands in the spring as well. And you might hear me whispering to my kids in the background. Here we go. Great. Well, hopefully many of you heard that. Certainly if you didn't for some reason, or if you want to hear some more, there's lots of calls online of these spring peepers. I find this sound to be completely mesmerizing and relaxing and takes me to a kind of a much more mindful and peaceful place. As a matter of fact, the recording of these spring peepers is used sometimes as white noise from some of the white noise apps to help people get to sleep at night. And you can find these online, or better yet, you can actually, starting now in the southern New England, if you have a chance to get outside, whether you're driving around or hiking around, in the evening is when these peepers start to call. Everywhere from suburban Boston through Western Mass and throughout New England, because these peepers are ubiquitous throughout most of the Northeast and Eastern US. Go see if you can find these peepers. Dusk and evening is the best time to hear them call. And I think this sound is like the sound of wilderness to me. Of course, it's great to hear wolves howling and other large wildlife, but to me, this is the forest at its best. And they're an indicator of large, intact forests functioning as they should be. And they've been calling like this for thousands of years. So this sound to me is very special. Another thing that's happening in our forest right now is millions of songbirds are migrating through from the south. This black-throated blue warbler likely spent the winter in the Caribbean and is now migrating to or through New England to breed in the summer in the north. And there's at least 3 dozen of these special species, these warbler species, and many other songbirds moving through our area right now. Now, I'm a botanist, not a wildlife biologist, so I can't help but throw in some special things that are happening in the forest right now related to plants. There's a special group of wildflowers that called spring ephemerals, meaning they bloom they live out their lifespan in the spring, where they sprout, they flower, they fruit, and then they fade away, all before the trees leaf out. They do this to take advantage of the spring sunlight. before the leaves fill out on the trees above them. So what we're looking at here, left to right, maybe many of you know these species, but the top left is the painted trillium, and as we go around clockwise are Dutchman's breeches, hepatica, and trout lily. And there's about a dozen other spring ephemeral species that are blooming, again, not quite yet in the Boston area or in Massachusetts, but in the next couple weeks, these things are going to explode in the forests of New England. Now, there's one thing that the spring peepers, the spring ephemerals, and the migrating songbirds all depend on, and that's large, intact, healthy forests. And we all depend on these same forests as well. So I thought of, I'm going to spring this on James, so that we're not going to do this in an interactive way. But I was thinking about this photograph last night and realized that this is also, I just put it in here because it's a great photo, but it also is a photo that was taken in early spring. So I'm going to ask you guys all to think about, not enter them in the chat, so this will be a personal quiz, and I can tell you the answer later. James, please remind me. Why do we know this is early spring? What are we seeing here that tells us that? Okay, so that's just a little thing to get you observing this picture as I continue. I don't know the mechanism, but when I hear peepers, as I mentioned earlier, or forest songbirds, or when I'm in the forest and smell pine trees or hear a roaring brook, it changes me physically. I feel more relaxed, more peaceful, more calm, and healthier. And in fact, recent studies have shown that time spent in nature has a measurable effect on our health. 2 hours in nature each week, whether in one dose or spread over several doses, can reduce stress, lower blood pressure, and boost our immune systems. That body of knowledge is just getting going. I read a report recently that until about 5 years ago, there were about 25 studies showing the benefits of forests on our individual health in a measurable way. And within the last 5 years, there have been about 1,000 other studies. So that's a really growing body of knowledge, is to understand how nature affects us directly and the mechanisms that are in play. But one thing that we've known for a long time is the role forests play in providing us with clean, clear, healthy drinking water. The 3 photos, other than the little girl in this picture, are taken at the Quabbin Reservoir. The Quabbin Reservoir is 65 miles west of Boston. It supplies 2.5 million people with clean, fresh drinking water every day. And it's surrounded by 60,000 acres of protected forest. Forests that every drop of water flows through those forests and is cleaned as it makes its way to the reservoir and then is directed to our drinking water largely in the Boston area and some other surrounding communities. Not only is it good for our health, but it's good for our economy, because protecting this forest negates the need to build and maintain extremely expensive water treatment and water filtration plants. The other benefit that the forest is doing here in the spring is that as the snows melt and as we get spring rains, as we are today, there's a lot of water flowing through our rivers. And if we didn't have the forest to absorb those waters like a sponge and hold them, we would have much more flashy rivers and much more floods in our cities and towns. And because the forest is holding that water and slowly releasing it, it provides a slower release of that water through the summer when we may experience drought. Especially both these events, floods and droughts, are much more probable in an era of a changing climate. So flood protection and drought protection are another couple benefits of the forest, in addition to clean drinking water. And all those benefits are local, tangible benefits that we can see and feel every day. But scaling out, forests provide us with a global benefit. Forests absorb and retain carbon. They pull carbon from the atmosphere. I'll give a shout out to my colleague Laura Marks, who I think is on this call with your kids today, who reminded me of this great graphic provided by NASA. And as I mentioned, what we're seeing here is that in this simple graphic, the forests or areas that are photosynthesizing, they're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere to help the plants grow, are in green here. So largely the forests of the world are in green. And what we're seeing in that hazy orange, yellowy orange color is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Again, this is a great graphic by NASA. And what I'm going to show you now is actually a dynamic animated version of this. And when we start, we're in the middle of winter. This is January 1st. So if we pay attention to the northern hemisphere, we see that there aren't many green areas. The forests are asleep. The forests are not photosynthesizing. The leaves are off the deciduous trees. And there's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. Now, when I hit this animation, we're going to see through the winter and into the spring, the carbon increasing in the atmosphere as the engine of photosynthesis, the engine of the forest, pulling carbon, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, gets going. But then as the summer and fall continue, those forests are going to green up and you're going to see them suck the carbon right out of the atmosphere. So with fingers crossed that the technology works. Here we are in the winter, February, March, where we are now, a lot of carbon dioxide. But here's the forest greening up across the northern hemisphere. And there's the carbon being pulled from the atmosphere. Now we're in the fall and winter again. The forests fade away. The carbon increases. The next year, we're watching the forest, the planet breathing as the forests pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and reduce the threat of climate change. Pretty amazing things to see. Actually, we can't see this, and that's why this graphic is so special. So the challenge we face is that in Massachusetts alone, we're losing 6,000 acres of forest each year to development. And while Massachusetts, with its high density of population, has the fastest pace in New England, that pattern of development and loss of forest and fragmentation is playing out across New England, across the Northeast. And unfortunately, this destroys the ability of the forest to do all those things we care about, to provide a home for frogs, birds, plants, and other wildlife, and to clean our water, to clean our air, to pull carbon from the atmosphere and give us the peace and health that we depend on. And these threats of development work in synergy, unfortunately, with the growing threats of climate change and additional threats to our forests of non-native invasive insects and diseases. So that can be daunting in itself. But the good news is that over the last 40 years, we are protecting more forest than we ever have before. And although we've seen decline, if we act now, we can still protect forest at a pace that keeps the forest functioning as we want it to. Massachusetts is still 60% forested, and 25% of the state of Massachusetts is protected from development. Like I said, over the past 40 years, we've protected more than half of the lands we've protected over the past 140 years across Massachusetts. So we've really had a focused and concerted effort to protect lands that benefit us all. That's 55 acres a day that we've been protecting in the last several years. And we need to maintain and increase this pace to be successful. At the Nature Conservancy, we do a few things. We protect forest lands directly and in partnership with our state and federal agencies and land trusts. And we develop rigorous science to guide the land conservation community. The Nature Conservancy just released a data set that tells us where to invest in forest conservation to allow plants and animals to cope with the impacts of climate change. These data were first developed in New England about 12 years ago. We pioneered the innovations here in New England, and just recently my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy completed a nationwide analysis identifying the resilient and connected landscapes across the entire continental US. And then to complement our science and our work on the ground, we work with our elected officials and public agencies to enhance policies and funding to get to scale. So if you're thinking, what's your role? What's my role? How can I help? I have a few thoughts for you. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of decisions that affect our forest landscape, even when we think at those largest scales of 32 million acres across New England. A lot of work gets done at the very local scale, local level, to protect open space, develop protected landscapes, to manage forests, to develop open space plans, to work on conservation commissions, planning boards, and open space plans in your town. Scaling up, you can work with and support your local land trust, larger land trusts, the Nature Conservancy, who are working at scale to get these lands protected and managed for all our health and well-being. And finally, you can let your legislators, your elected officials know at local, state, and federal scales that this is important to you, that you want policies in place to achieve success and conserve our forests for our generation and future generations. If we can increase the protection of our forests across Massachusetts and New England in the coming years, we can see all those benefits, from clean water to carbon to wildlife, for our kids and our grandkids and into the future. I'm going to wrap up with a couple things. One is a quote I just came across from an author whose last name I think I know how to pronounce, Richard Louv, who wrote a great book called Last Child in the Woods. And related to the recent studies I mentioned on the role of forests and natural areas for our health and well-being, he wrote, "All the studies point in one direction. Nature is not only nice to have, but it's a have to have for our physical health and cognitive function." I was out in the forests of Western Massachusetts just a couple weeks ago as the winter snows were melting and the streams were flowing freely. So I'm going to leave this, my presentation part of our discussion today, with the sound of a flowing stream in Western Massachusetts, which is yet another sound that is packaged for sleeping apps, but is to me yet another sound that I'm sure lowers my blood pressure, reduces my stress, and boosts my immune system. So thank you all for listening to me blab on this morning. And I think James is going to take over, and we're going to have a chance for some questions and answers.
Yeah, Andy, thank you so much. Listening to you present, I was reminded of the knowledge and love for the natural world that has inspired me to, on many different occasions, bring in leaves from the forest and photos to have you identify them, be my virtual guide. So thank you very much, Andy. I got a few questions here coming in, and one, I just want to revisit, if you could, Andy, some of the stats that you used in the presentation, specifically the amount of Massachusetts that's forested and how much is protected. We just asked to repeat those numbers if we could.
Yeah, there's a lot. I know I threw a lot of numbers out. Massachusetts has 3 million acres of forest, and in a state that's 5 million acres in size, that's 60% of the land area covered in forest. And about 25% of Massachusetts is currently protected. Some of that is not forest, some of that is other land types and wetland areas and water bodies. But I think it's probably safe to say that about 25% of our forested area is protected, which means 75% of our forested area, 75% of those 3 million acres is privately owned.
Thank you, Andy. And if that doesn't answer the question, please feel free just to jump back into the chat, and we can revisit that. And just a reminder, everyone, yeah, please put your questions in the Q&A, or we're also checking the chat, and that's fine too. Um, Andy, I just want to step back for a second. How long have you been studying the forest? And I'm curious, how did you, what made you start this path in your life?
Yeah, I've been a tree hugger most of my life, but if you just to, without telling my entire life story, I do credit my grandfather for pulling me out of my suburban upbringing and taking me up to Canada to go fishing, where I first saw unbroken forest, where I really saw, wow, this is a real thing. This is a big, vast machine of a landscape, of an ecosystem. And then my passion and interest and knowledge just grew as you mentioned, as I got my undergraduate degree in plant sciences, a graduate degree in forest ecology. And I've had a wonderful opportunity to spend really important time in some of the coolest forests across the East Coast. From the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which have diverse, lush forests, to the Catskills and Adirondacks of New York State, and now the wonderful forests of Massachusetts and New England. But each step along the way, the more I knew the forest and the more I learned about trees, the deeper my passion grew for the complexities and the nuances and the power that's happening out there in the forest right now.
Andy, thank you. So one other kind of specific question coming out of the presentation. Peepers and wood frogs, are they different? Ginger says she thought she was hearing wood frogs. Can you clarify?
Yeah, they're definitely, you're totally right. You were hearing wood frogs in the recording that I played. They often use the same wetlands and pools. They're completely different species. A wood frog is probably 2 or 3 or 4 times bigger than a spring peeper. They make that croaking, quacking sound that you heard. And they're another really cool harbinger of spring and important indicator that we've got good forests and good wetlands working in harmony together. But yeah, they're 2 different species that use the same pools to breed in the spring, lay their eggs, and it's where their tadpoles grow up. I should say too, one thing I didn't mention, that these vernal pools are very special pools in the forest because they arrive in the spring when there's snowmelt and a lot of rain, and they often dry up in the summer. So these frogs have to live out their life cycle along with some salamanders and other species in a short amount of time. But the benefit is that because they dry up, there's no fish. So there's no predators that are going to eat the frogs or their eggs. So it's a special small ecosystem that allows these peepers and these wood frogs and other amphibians and other species to survive. But short answer, yes, you got that right. Wood frogs are different, and you heard them in the recording.
Any question from an attendee? And what type of forest or trees are the most effective in cleansing our world? And I think that's in reference to carbon.
Yeah, I've seen some documentation of that, and I know one of my colleagues on this call who's muted would probably be able to jump in. There is a variation in trees' ability to pull carbon from the atmosphere. And I can't recall which species are the strongest. I think, well, I'm not going to guess because I run a high risk of getting that wrong. But I will say that intact large forests that are managed well, that are growing old, growing bigger trees. So this is not tree species, but the type of forest is critical to pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. The biggest threat that we have to losing this engine of carbon sequestration is to lose our forests. And so the more forest we can maintain, and in many cases, if we can have a subset of those forests grow to really old age, where these big trees are adding on huge amounts of carbon each year, and storing it for long periods of time. That's what we're going to need for success. I can follow up with anyone and find out, because I did just read this recently on the rates of sequestration from different tree species, but they're not hugely different in the Northeast among each other, as far as I recall.
Eddie, we have a question. Someone who recently moved to New England says there seems to be many areas in the forest where trees are dead. What are the pest problems in New England forests and what trees are affected?
Yeah, really good question. And I'll be brief because I could be not brief on this topic. It is to me, it's one of the more daunting challenges we face, is that we lost our elm trees in the early part of the 20th century, along with our chestnuts. And in the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen hemlock woolly adelgid attack our hemlock trees, beech bark disease attack our beech trees, and a host of largely leaf-eating insects attacking our oak trees, the most famous of which is gypsy moth. Winter moth is another one. So what you were likely seeing, unfortunately, is the combination of a heavy outbreak of gypsy moths and winter moths in the last 5 years, coupled with some very droughty summers, has led to literally, unfortunately, thousands of acres of oak stands in Massachusetts having died. So often the trees are resilient enough that they can withstand 1 year of defoliation by gypsy moths, but a number of years in a row, in combination with a number of these non-native insects that have no predators and no parasites to keep them in check, coupled with drought, is enough to knock these to kill large stands of trees. So most likely you are seeing large oak stands, which are common in southern New England and in Massachusetts, succumbing to this suite of challenges and threats.
Andy, for Massachusetts forests that are not currently protected, how are they managed in terms of future protection versus development?
So in southern New England, so James, I'm sorry, read that for me one more time. Just I want to make sure I got it right.
Yeah, the question is, for forests that are in Massachusetts that are not currently protected, how are they managed in terms of future protection versus development?
Right. So in southern New England, we have a unique situation that's a little different than for instance, our northern forest in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. We have many, many thousands of private forest landowners whose decisions will direct and inform the future trajectory of our vast forests. And it's critically important. And people own forests for lots of different reasons. They own them for scenic value, for peace and tranquility. And many are dependent on some income from their forest, whether it's maple sugaring, maple syrup, or timber harvests occasionally, periodically to receive some income. So it's a variety of forest landowners whose individual decisions add up to the whole of the forest. But one thing that we've seen consistently is that forest landowners care about their forest and the forests around them. And so there's lots of tools available to them, such as current use programs, which can abate their tax burden for owning forest land and allow them to keep their forests as forests, because that's usually critical for the landowners and critical for all the values we talked about this afternoon. But it's a series of individual decisions, and landowners that are interested in protecting their land often reach out to the Nature Conservancy, to other organizations and land trusts, or to state agencies to initiate a discussion. And often that can be a quick process, or sometimes it plays out over generations as parents hand down their legacy and their assets and their lands to their children. But land protection options are abundant, and that's why there's a steady stream of land flowing into the protected land base every year in Massachusetts and beyond.
Thank you, Andy. Another question interesting. The question is about the role of wildfires. How do wildfires come into play in New England forest, and what can we do about them?
Well, wildfires is a good question. You know, the northern forests of New England have earned a nickname called the asbestos forests because they generally do not burn. They're very fireproof in general. So these are the northern hardwood forests and the damp, moist forests of New England. There are exceptions, though. There is the forest that we see in southern New England, especially the oak forests and the pitch pine and scrub oak forests on Cape Cod, southeastern Massachusetts. The islands are very fire prone, so they haven't earned that nickname, the asbestos forest. And managing those forests in a way that both protects public health and safety so that there aren't large conflagrations of fire is important. And that also has very strong ecological benefits because these forests, if they're kept in an open habitat, provide unique habitats for a unique set of species that are very uncommon and in some cases rare. But for the most part, except for during drought periods and when there's carelessness on the part of humans, accidentally starting a fire through brush pile burning or careless cigarettes, wildfires are not as common in New England as they are out in the western US, where fire is definitely a part of the landscape, where dry lightning storms ignite fires and have historically for thousands of years. And based on the management regimes and insects and disease killing trees out in the west, we've seen horrible results and conflagrations of tremendous wildfires. But that's less relevant to our northern forests in New England.
Andy, we have a couple of questions about the age of forests in Massachusetts. And one of them, the question is, can you talk about how forest cover in Massachusetts has changed over time and how old forests are in different parts of the state?
Yeah. So, I mean, Massachusetts has a really interesting forest history, and I give credit to our colleagues at the Harvard Forest who have spent a lot of the researchers have spent entire careers understanding the history of our forests in New England. So, in the 18th and 19th century, a majority of New England was cleared. The forests were cleared for pasture land, for agriculture, for the wood needed for charcoal and for heat. And in Massachusetts alone, while pre-colonial times had 90% of Massachusetts covered with forest, by the mid 19th century, 1850 or so, 70% of Massachusetts was cleared. Only 30% of the state was forested. Now, when people found out that the soils in the Midwest were much better than the rocky soils of New England, they headed out west and abandoned their pastures and farmland. And the forest, being as resilient as it is, regrew in New England to the point where 70% of Massachusetts was covered in forest. It grew by itself. We didn't have to replant it. 70% of Massachusetts was forested by 1960. And the 60%, the 10% we've lost in the last 4 or 5 decades, has been due to development. So that's the history. Now, what was the second part of the question?
The second part was how old are forests in different parts of the state?
Oh yeah. So because that abandonment of forest land happened pretty abruptly in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the forests regrew at all about the same pace. And so by the turn of the next century, by the year 2000, a lot of our forests were in that, what we call kind of middle-aged bracket. They were all kind of 80 to 100 years old. And of course, forests have been managed throughout that time, cutting for forest products and for lumber. But in general, our forests tend to be in that 100-year age bracket. In terms of old growth forests, there are very few forests that are truly old growth. A tiny fraction of 1% of our forests, just about 2,000 or 3,000 acres out of 3 million acres, are truly old growth forests that have never been harvested. But the state agencies and the conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy and others are working to build that old growth component back onto the landscape, as well as some younger forests, which, as I mentioned earlier, are critical for some species. But that older growth forest is also critical for our carbon, climate solutions, and for special habitat for a lot of species as well. So short answer, mostly 100-year-old forests now on various rotations and management, and very tiny bit of old growth forest, but the potential for future old growth in our forest reserves on state lands and nonprofit and land trust lands.
Andy, what about renewable energy development and forest? What kind of impacts are we seeing from development of renewable energy in Massachusetts forest?
We've seen impacts in the last few years. So when there were incentives for wind development in Massachusetts, we saw a small flurry of activity on ridgetops, which unfortunately I'll just back up and say we need renewable energy. We need renewable energy as a replacement for fossil fuels if we're going to, as part of the solution, if we're going to combat climate change. The thing we have to do is we have to balance and site and operate renewable energy in a way that has the least impact on our forests and as well as our oceans and our wetlands and our rivers. So to site it and operate renewable energy in a way that has the least impact on these ecosystems. And at the Nature Conservancy, we have spent a lot of time and energy in Massachusetts, in New England, and actually across the globe in designing energy projects, working with energy developers to site all sorts of renewable energy in places that will have the least impact on our natural systems and the ecosystems we depend on, and which are also a critical part of the climate solution. So in Massachusetts, when we, like I said, we had a brief incentive program for wind development, we saw a few commercial scale wind developments on ridgetops, which unfortunately fragmented those large and intact landscapes. But right now, the key player is for forests is commercial scale solar development. And a report by our colleagues at the Massachusetts Audubon Society just reported that over the last 5 years or so, 25% of the land that's being converted and lost, forest land that's being lost, is due to solar, commercial scale solar development. So the state is really working hard right now to find the right balance between incentivizing solar development, which again we will need to solve the climate solution, and doing it in a way that directs it toward already developed places and in already fragmented and degraded areas, because it has the potential to be a tremendous impact on our forest resources. So we want to do it right, and we want to do it in the right places.
And is the Nature Conservancy working with MAPC and the New England region to maintain forest cover?
Well, we certainly, MAPC is one of the regional planning agencies around the state. The MAPC is the one in the Boston metro area, and we and our colleagues work with all the regional planning agencies, from the Pioneer Valley to the Berkshires, to the Boston area, to north of Boston and south of Boston, to find solutions that work for communities, that work for the forests, work for rivers, so that everybody's kind of got a stake in the decisions and the discussion, and everybody's got a stake in the outcomes. But TNC works with just the widest array of partners, including those regional planning agencies. The state agencies are critical, both the the conservation organizations, but agencies like the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, Department of Ecological Restoration, Marine Fisheries, but also transportation departments and others. And we work with local communities at the town by town scale. So I think I just threw out a lot of information that may or may not have answered the specific question, but yes, we do work with MAPC on many nature-based solutions and climate solutions and climate adaptation solutions, and opportunities to protect land at scale across the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Andy. And I think I would just say too that anyone who's on the call today and wants to follow up, has a different question, or doesn't feel they quite got to the answer they were looking for, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to try to help with that. Because we've got a lot of questions covering a lot of ground, and not the same opportunity that you have for follow-up in a conversation. So thanks for your patience, and please do follow up with us. A couple of questions we have about the animation on carbon, and I believe, Andy, that we could link to that in a follow-up email that we'll send to everyone after the webinar. Is that correct?
That's definitely correct. Yep, that's a public data set and graphic that, again, my colleague alerted to me on the web.
Yeah, so we will. I just made a note that we'll include that when we send a follow-up email to everyone, so that you'll be able to look at that online. I also find that graphic to just be really, really striking. Andy, not sure if this is a question that you can answer, or this might be one that we need to find another person to tackle at a different point. But how is TNC working to protect the Amazon from further destruction?
Yeah, I can take a quick swing at it, and it's probably it could be its own webinar. There's a lot of engagement there, and I'm familiar with some, but not all of it. But I mean, one thing that Nature Conservancy does is we work with corporate entities who are seeking better ways to protect the environment through their practices. So we've worked with some of the big agricultural companies to direct their Amazon agriculture to already cleared areas, because that's obviously one of the biggest threats to Amazon forests, which are also, the hugest part of the lungs of our planet, pulling carbon from the atmosphere, to minimize the destruction of original or native or pristine, otherwise undamaged forests. So we're working with some of the big agricultural companies, again, to try to minimize their clearing of untouched forest. We also have done a lot of work with indigenous communities, and with opportunities to build to bring revenue to Amazon communities through the carbon sequestration and the carbon markets that they're providing. So our forests are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, but the owners or holders or overseers of those forests don't always get compensated for those, what we call ecosystem benefits or ecosystem services. So we're trying to use national and international mechanisms to bring revenue to communities in the Amazon as a payment for those ecosystem values. So those are just a couple of the strategies that I'm aware of, and I'm sure we have staff on the ground in the Amazon in Brazil and surrounding countries that could go deeper for the question.
Hey, Andy, this is Liz Alverson.
Okay.
I'm seeing some other questions coming in from our audience. We live in Western Mass, and much of the forest is privately owned. Is there a way of knowing what the best owner approach is for forest management?
Best owner. Yeah, Liz, I'm just struggling with exactly what the question is getting at, the best owner approach. I mean, if if um, if the question is kind of directing at how to engage individual landowners, like I said earlier, everybody's land is in their own hands and it's their choice. And there's a lot of well, let me just say this: there's a lot of resources coming out of the University of Amherst, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, that informs landowners of their options with land, for everything from estate planning to how to take advantage of tax deferral programs. So again, if the questioner has follow-up, I'm happy to talk offline, or we can do that. But if the question is related to resources for landowners and how to help them make decisions, we can include in our follow-up material a link to the UMass Amherst extension folks who really work closely with forested landowners throughout Western Mass and throughout the state.
Andy, and I apologize, I muted myself a minute ago to try to avoid any distracting background noise, and so that's why I disappeared unintentionally. Changing pace a little bit, going back to your presentation, you had a slide, and you wanted us to think about how we know it's spring. Slide.
Good memory. So that's good. So let's see. Yeah, so I'm not going to go back there because who knows what that will do to our technology. But in the springtime, what I think we were seeing was oak trees. They have these unique flowers. You wouldn't think of them as flowers, but they're called catkins. Birch trees have those too, where they're kind of long, elongated. The male flowers are these elongated flowers that send out the pollen. They can be 3-4 inches long. And I saw in that picture a lot of those catkins just emerging. So that told me that it wasn't the middle of summer. It wasn't. It was actually springtime, probably because the maples looked like they had leafed out early, the maples and birches, and the oaks leaf out a little later. And so it was probably an late April scene in that picture.
Eddie, we have a question that I was also interested in asking, and relates to another question that I wanted to throw in. And the first question is, do you have a favorite forest to visit in Massachusetts? And then the second question I was going to throw in on the back of that is, are there any guides or resources that you would recommend to folks? And that is for hiking and
yeah.
Understanding the forest.
I should have a favorite, but some of the places we've protected we meaning the Nature Conservancy, in the Berkshire Hills coming out of west of Northampton area, it's a truly New England, you can't get there from here kind of feeling. There's no roads that take you directly there. So this is the Westfield River watershed, and some of there's state forests. There's the Nature Conservancy's Coles Brook Preserve and Dead Branch Preserve, and I just love feeling how lost and remote and quiet you can get there, as well as some of our lands in the very southwestern corner of Massachusetts in the southern Berkshires. But I do, as I've told James, almost any forest really excites me. I even like walking. I live a mile away from the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Watertown and Cambridge, and just seeing the trees there inspire me. So and there's a huge network of protected lands in Massachusetts to take advantage of. The state agencies now have interactive websites to look for hiking and protected areas, and as do the Nature Conservancy has their preserves listed online, and our colleagues at the trustees and Mass Audubon Society have their preserves online. So I would say go where it's convenient, because these magical things are happening all across the state. In terms of, I don't use a lot of field guides these days, but one of my favorites, if you're interested in taking one step deeper into understanding what you're seeing when you go out in the field, is I have a dog-eared copy of Newcomb's Wildflower Guide on my bookshelf that I got way back in college, which, if you add up the numbers that James listed at the beginning in my bio, you realize was many decades ago. And Newcomb's Wildflower Guide is it's very user-friendly, and you can achieve success and figure out what you're looking at in the field pretty quickly. The Peterson guides for both birds and plants do well. And I've got we can list more of these in our follow-up thank you email. But I've got a little book called a Tree Finder. There's a whole series. I've got a Fern Finder. It must be no more than 40 pages long, and it's the size of a wallet. And it's got a few keys that can help you make decisions and find out what kind of tree you're looking at. So Tree Finder, just a little pocket-sized book, is a great resource, as well as the whole series like Fern Finder, and they've got some others.
Andy, thank you so much. Folks, we are reaching the end of our time today, and I know we didn't get to all the questions, and I apologize for that, and we thank you for asking them. In the chat, as Liz Alverson mentioned, please email your questions, and I'm going to read this email address out again: liz.alverson, that's ALVERSON @tnc.org. We will be sure to follow up with you. And again, apologies for not getting to everything. Andy, thank you so much. I hope that others enjoyed hearing from you today as much as I did. And folks, please, stay in touch with us. You can find us on nature.org/mass. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And we, again, thank you so much for being here today, and wish you all well. Okay, so we're going to sign off, and thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.